the newsagents.
When the news came through yesterday that there had been this attack in Lebanon on people having pagers that belonged to Hezbollah and thousands of pagers exploding simultaneously, it seemed faintly unbelievable, ludicrous, ridiculous. But it's real, and it did happen. And now we see that there is a day two. This time, not pagers exploding, but handheld walkie-talkies. It looks like an astonishing security failure by Hezbollah and a military success for Israel, although they have not claimed responsibility, but it's hard to see who else would have the capability to do that. But what about the ethics of it? What about the legality of it? Where does this leave peace in a region which is already at boiling point? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's Jon.
It's Emily. And we are reunited, actually, for the first time this week in Newsagents Global Headquarters.
Did you have fun in New York?
Yeah, but I have to say, my world turned upside down when I heard the story that was coming out of Lebanon. And you could tell in the kind of the radio presenters, the newsreaders' voices, they didn't quite know how to respond to it. It is the kind of land of futurist exploding devices. And Hezbollah are a prescribed terrorist group in this country and many others. And yet there's also something that is sort of, the scale was so big, right? So you're kind of going, what just happened? How did you know that every pager was going to be a Hezbollah operative?
And, how did you manage to get explosives into pagers? And we still don't know what happened, whether it was a lithium battery that blew up. And, there are kind of myriad questions. The defence world, a friend of mine who works for a very big defence company, just kind of marvelling at the technological achievement of what they had to have done to do this. Did they have people in the factory where the pagers were being made? Did they intercept the whole shipment and put in some explosives, fiddled with the software so that they could trigger an explosion at any moment? There are all those questions. The military world is absolutely fascinated by. There are also the kind of psychological impact of this, because Hezbollah had gone to these rather 1980s devices. We all remember pagers from our early journalistic days.
I would say 2001 election.
Well, I'd go back even further than that. The major years I remember being about pagers. And Hezbollah were using them because they thought this would be a security blanket that would stop Israel intervening. Well, you got that one wrong, given what has happened if it was Israel.
They thought their phones were being targeted. I mean, that's the irony, isn't it? So, or not the irony, that's the explanation, that they thought the cell phone network was being targeted. And so I think they'd had the order from on high, put down your phones, don't take your phones into anywhere that you can be traced. So they all have pagers instead, and le voilà. And
you saw the pictures on the news of people standing in a fruit shop or a butcher's or going to get their hair cut, and bang, there's suddenly, in their midriff, there is suddenly acute pain and discomfort because something has exploded on them.
Yeah.
So there is an element in which it is quite remarkable. But what is the Israeli calculation in doing this? Is it a part of something else? What is going to be the response of Hezbollah? And where does it stand in terms of, as you say, Emily, legality, or maybe ethics? Because, of course, Hezbollah is a prescribed terrorist organisation which has been waging a low-level war against Israel, against northern Israel, since the attack by Hamas on October the 7th. So there's an awful lot to unpack, and we're going to do that with the former diplomatic editor at Newsnight, Mark Urban, your long-standing colleague, Emily, and former colleague of mine. And I should say that we recorded the interview with Mark just before we heard about this day two of attacks with these kind of handheld radio walkie-talkies also exploding. Now, Mark, great to have you with us.
It's a pleasure.
What did you think when you heard thousands injured by pagers exploding in Lebanon? It was just extraordinary, wasn't it?
It was extraordinary, but perhaps being the sort of person I am, I think my first thought was not probably the same as most people's. I very quickly assumed there was the capability to do it. So my first thought is this the beginning of a major military operation by the Israelis against Hezbollah? In other words, are airstrikes and all sorts of other things now going to intensify as they attempt to capitalize on this disruption and presumably panic and chaos that was sown across a big slice of the Hezbollah network by these thousands of pages exploding?
So what were they?
Well, I mean, this is a fascinating question. There is some reporting today, and I think it seems like the most likely explanation, that they had come up with this operation a few months ago. They had succeeded in, if you like, hijacking the Hezbollah supply chain for thousands of these gadgets, and that they were handed out for use among people in the organization, and that not long ago someone became suspicious. There was some kind of problem. Either one went off prematurely, or someone in the organization gave it a closer examination and became suspicious. And so the kind of idea of use it or lose it, that having it implanted this extraordinary network of exploding devices in the pockets and hands of all these sworn enemies, that they were just going to have to accept that they couldn't use it as they might want to. And that if they didn't want Hezbollah to just throw all these pages into dustbins, they had to use them immediately. That seems to be the most compelling theory that I've seen today.
I mean, it's terrifying, isn't it, really, Mark, in a way, because there is almost no chance that Hezbollah's not going to retaliate. Where does that leave each side? I mean, where does that leave, wider peace, really?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they'll try and retaliate. They have said that they will answer. I mean, of course, Israel hasn't officially claimed this act. It's in the league of sort of Mossad, neither confirm nor deny type of operation. Hezbollah has said that it will respond, but of course at this moment, when it's smarting from this major internal security failure and having a lot of its people hurt, I mean, you wouldn't expect them to say, well, you really got us there. So in a way, in order to not to lose too much face among their community, that they have to promise revenge. Yeah. As to how they could do so and what form it would take, I mean, look, there's been this state of no peace, no war across the Lebanese border since October the 7th. Thousands of missiles and Israeli strikes have gone back and forth. And Hezbollah seems to have been governed throughout this by the judgment that they mustn't get drawn in to a sort of all-out, no-holds-barred confrontation with Israel, in which they use every weapon at their disposal, to hit targets in Tel Aviv and all that sort of thing, which I think they are capable of doing. The question about why they've made that judgment is a really interesting one. But I think presumably the same factors still hold true even after this, what for them is clearly shocking incident.
So what is the psychology of all of this? How does this leave Hezbollah and their minders, if you like, Iran, when Israel shows that it's got the capability of taking out the Hamas leader when he's in Tehran? They've taken out a nuclear scientist with apparently a remote-controlled machine gun mounted on a flatbed truck, and now they've done this.
I think you have to see all of this in the context of this very long-term conflict between Iran and Israel, in which, of course, the Iranian desire to have control of certainly the nuclear fuel process, and Israel would say obviously the bomb as well, is the critical thing from the Iranian point of view. I was talking to a senior Israeli military person a few days after the October the 7th attack, and he said that they had feared, of course, that it was a coordinated thing between Hamas and Hezbollah and part of a kind of general Middle East war that people still feel could engulf the region if this all escalates out of control. He said within hours, as soon as I realised that Hezbollah wasn't going all out, I started to become comforted by that. And it confirmed the suspicion the Israelis have that the high-end Hezbollah capabilities, so all of these long-range precision strike weapons that they have, missiles, drones, all the rest of it, are in effect Iran's deterrent. That they will only be used if Israel looks like it's about to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, or indeed has just done so. That is the purpose of the Hezbollah advanced military capability, to deter Israel from striking Iranian nuclear facilities. Let's say they do it. Now, this same person I was talking to said, let's say they do it. Then, to paraphrase this person, he said, then we will have a very difficult 2 or 3 months, and then we will strike their nuclear facilities. So you understand, once that weapon is used, Iran has no other deterrent, and whatever damage they do to Israel during the period that Hezbollah would use all of its capability is done. And at that point, there's nothing further to come once Israel takes out the Iranian nuclear program. So that's the calculation I heard from one senior Israeli about why Hezbollah still, despite all the things that the Israelis have done, some would say to provoke them, others would say to take advantage of this state of play vis-a-vis Iran. Yeah. They haven't used all their capabilities against Israel.
Mark, just talk us through where the other sort of superpowers are on this. I mean, we've heard Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, this morning distancing America from any knowledge that this was going on. Do they have to take a position on this? I mean, are we going to see Israel condemned for this by America? Or because, I mean, I think the CIA has in the past worked with Mossad, hasn't it, on some of these extraordinary sort of technological, I don't know if you call them innovations or whatever, but we've sort of seen them work hand in glove before, and I guess that's why it was important for America to say, this isn't us.
Yes. Well, I mean, I guess most sort of famously or infamously, there was the assassination of Imad Munir, who was a Lebanese Hezbollah kingpin, who was killed in Damascus quite a few years ago now. Now, initially, everybody thought that was the Israelis. And then it became clear it was the Americans. They had their own agenda with him, but that they had cooperated with the Israelis on that operation. So yes, there is a history of sort of intimate cooperation in some of these matters. But notwithstanding the fact that you'll see all over Twitter or X this morning, former US sort of covert operations types from the CIA and other agencies gobsmacked and expressing admiration for the quality of this as an operation. Notwithstanding that, I don't think there is any evidence that the Americans were involved. And, of course, they want to some extent, insulate themselves from the consequences. The same was true when Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran. America quickly said, look, A, obviously not us, and B, we knew nothing about it. They do want to insulate themselves from the consequences of some of these moves.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting point, because I wonder, this operation, which you described interestingly as use it or lose it, you have this technology, it's being investigated, we better press the button now. The Israeli state you always imagine to be very joined up, that everybody knows what everyone else is doing. But you had an American envoy arriving in Jerusalem 2 days ago to try and advance the peace process, the talks that are taking place in Egypt to get the release of the hostages that Hamas took in Gaza. And at the same time, you've got someone in Mossad pressing the button which says presumably ignite, and blows up all these pages in Lebanon, just making everything much more complicated. And if all the effort is to getting out the hostages, then why do this that kind of adds another layer? to it?
Well, I've seen the fact that Hezbollah, in a sense, it uses limited violence, but it does, from an Arab or Palestinian perspective, act in support of Hamas in Gaza, in the sense that they've made pretty clear, and the same goes for the Houthi campaign too, that they're acting in support of the Palestinians, and the inference being that, well, if all of that is kind of solved, or at least there's some kind of enduring ceasefire that comes out of it to the satisfaction of Hamas, that Hezbollah and the Houthis would stop their military action too. So there is this linkage, and of course the Israelis are frustrated by this linkage, and there's been a good deal of commentary in Israel in recent days, because there is an expectation that a major operation against Hezbollah is imminent, that they're trying to break this link. They're trying to decouple Hezbollah from Hamas and say, look, they want to stop the rockets falling in the north of Israel, the fact they've had to evacuate tens of thousands of people from those communities. I mean, thousands evacuated from the other side of the border too by the Lebanese because of the Israeli strikes, that they want to end this situation and decouple Hezbollah and Hamas. So it is a very complex dynamic. I don't think the Israelis will succeed by this action in decoupling Hezbollah, and in that sense try to demoralise its rank and file and embarrass it in the face of Lebanese more widely.
And don't forget that tickets for the Newsagents live show at the Royal Albert Hall in London go on sale on Friday the 20th. To get them, you'll need to download Global Player. It's free, and you can listen to all of us every day, every episode of the Newsagents there. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about both the ethics and the legality of what just happened in Lebanon. And we can talk to Philippe Sands, who is Professor of Law at UCL, international criminal barrister, and somebody who's kind of thought and written extensively on, I guess, the sort of rights and wrongs of war in this way. Philippe, what was your first reaction to this?
My first reaction was, well, this is a new one, and pretty scary. I think probably everyone has the same reaction. How on earth did they do that? And what happens to my phone or my pager? And of course, more information has come out subsequently, which indicates, but who knows, we've learned always to be careful what we initially hear, that the phones may have been tampered with and more substances introduced into them, which made what happened possible. But I suppose the very first thing that someone with my background wearing the sort of international lawyer's hat is that the golden rule that we were always taught and which we practice, or of course not always followed, is that if you're going to target a military objective, you have to distinguish between civilian and military targets. And the sheer scale of this, the number of devices and the number of people who are reported to have been injured and also killed, then the immediate reaction is, how on earth could this distinguish between a civilian and a military objective? I mean, some of the names already, we know there are apparently diplomats, one diplomat from Iran. There are presumably others, parents who let their child use a pager or some such thing. We just don't know. But the sheer scale raises that fundamental question.
So when you talk, Philippe, I'm thinking immediately of the Skripal poisonings, which we called, an invasion of sovereign territory because people are being biologically or chemically, poisoned on UK sovereign soil. I mean, do you equate that as an act, not in terms of who it's targeting, obviously, but just in terms of the act itself?
Well, it is an analogy of sorts. I mean, I must say, I had just seen the sort of the TV series about the Salisbury killings, and it made me immediately think, okay, Mr. Putin and his players will say there are these characters who wish us harm living in Salisbury. We're going to target them, and this we're going to do it by means of a particular poison. And we now know from that story that others were affected by that poison. That raises a fundamental question. But beyond that, as I said, what do we think about these kinds of acts taking place in distant locations? And so at this point, we raise questions. We can't give hard answers, but these are the kinds of questions that one would want to be thinking about.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I suppose that making it analogous to something that has happened in the UK is difficult, given that, Hezbollah has been firing rockets into northern Israel since October the 7th. Israel has been retaliating. It may not be all-out war, but the skirmishing has been pretty intense in that situation, and therefore could be argued this is just a continuation of this, admittedly by more means, but it's the same.
Like a drone,
Yeah.
I guess. I mean, it's like a minuscule drone, right?
Right. There is an armed conflict underway, plainly, and that means you are in a different situation from the Salisbury kind of situation. That's absolutely right. But the question, of course, someone like I would ask is, what are the consequences? It's the thin end of a pretty large wedge. What if Hezbollah would have the capacities to do a similar thing the other way around, using not pagers, but iPhones, and causing harm to 3,000 people and killing 9 people in Israel by those means, saying they had targeted military types and so on and so forth. We would not be comfortable with that. I'm thinking also just of another analogous situation. A friend of mine, a Ukrainian writer called Victoria Amelina, was killed last year. She happened to be having dinner in a restaurant frequented by Ukrainian military, and the justification for the targeting of that restaurant was precisely that it was frequented by military types and therefore was a legitimate target. And so the central question that you're asking at this point is, at what point do certain people become legitimate targets, or, horrible phrase, collateral damage for a legitimate target? And that's the kind of debate you want to go into. And I think the international lawyers who deal with humanitarian law, as the area is called, are constantly wanting to narrow down the window of these kinds of acts, because there is a fear that the wider the window opens, the more people are going to be sucked into it. And that's the concern. But the issues that you're raising are exactly the ones that you would want to think about in this context.
So, Philippe, your argument has been very nuanced. If I sort of reduced it to a binary question, which is fundamentally, does this break the Geneva Convention? Which way would you be inclined to argue it?
It's nuanced because one of the things I've learned, as you have both learned, you're very careful and diligent reporters, is that until you're fully on top of the facts, you try not to express a clear view one way or the other. My inclination is that this opens a door that is potentially very problematic, and you can see the copycat type of situations arising and how people would react. So it's worrisome. It's also, frankly, personally scary, because it brings into our own homes the kinds of capacities, and so it concentrates the mind in that way. So on its face, frankly, yes, it seems problematic, but there are contrary arguments that have been made, and it all turns on these points of detail that we don't yet have a handle on.
What was really interesting was that Philippe Sands' first response was actually a much more personal thing than I was expecting. And that was how it got me as well. I just suddenly started thinking that war had moved into my handbag, quite frankly. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like we've grown up thinking that war is something that happens on borders of countries, between countries. It happens in the sky, it happens at sea. And suddenly the thing about this particular act is that it is so domestic. If it was reinterpreted by a foreign operative against us, if it was weaponized, against people who had iPhones or, any kind of gadget, I find that really scary. It's like we've just reintroduced a whole new level of warfare that I hadn't imagined at all.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was my reaction to it. I think that I'm trying to imagine any other military that would have the capability. I mean, we know that Russia still produces nerve agents and chemical weapons, and we saw it with the Novichok attack and all the rest of it. I don't believe that this will be generalised, and I don't believe there are many militaries, maybe Russia, maybe China, maybe the US, that
you
would
don't
have
need that many.
That would would have the
point.
capability to do that. I still feel relatively safe. This was so specific and kind of focused.
If Israel does it against Hezbollah, then you can say, yes, they targeted terrorist operatives. But if Russia just wants to do it, or China wants to do it as a terrorist attack, they can. That can be a terrorist attack. I mean, I don't know. I think that's still an invasion on sovereign land that is unexpected. And no, it's not bringing down the Twin Towers, but you could have that devastating impact by doing it if you targeted 2,000 mobile phones.
In a moment, we will be back, and we're going to be talking about Sue Gray, Keir Starmer's very well paid Chief of Staff. So Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff, Sue Gray, who you will remember led the Partygate investigation, was a senior civil servant herself, jumped ship to become Chief of Staff when Keir Starmer was the leader of the opposition, but is now in number 10. And depending on which reports you read, is the all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing kind of puppeteer of the Downing Street operation, or is someone who's just trying to do her best for Keir Starmer. But the story that's come out today is that she is paid more than the Prime Minister.
Yeah, this is a BBC story by Chris Mason and Henry Zeffman, and they've been told that Sue Gray asked for and was given a salary of 170,000, which they think is approximately 3,000 more than the Prime Minister himself. And when this was raised with her that she was going to be paid slightly more, was it an inconvenient fact? Should it come out? She sort of, brushed it aside and said, we'll deal with that. Now, I guess the question is, at the heart of this, yes, is it inappropriate for her to be paid more than the Prime Minister? And B, in whose interest, cui bono, is it for this kind of thing to come out in the lead up to the Labour conference? And I guess it speaks to what you were saying, Sopes, about this tension right at the top of the sort of civil service, really, between Sue Gray and someone who she has long had a problematic relationship with, Simon Case, who is the outgoing head of the civil service.
Yeah. And so I've been told two things. That one is that Sue Gray is swimming outside her lane far too much, and she's getting involved in things that she shouldn't just get involved with. And compared to when Blair was in office, his Chief of Staff was Jonathan Powell, who'd also come from the civil service, but was nothing like as senior as Sue Gray was. And Jonathan Powell just stuck to machinery of government, whereas Sue Gray seems to be involved in an awful lot more. Other people are saying she's doing it because no one else is doing the jobs properly, and there are too many other people who are just not making sure that the Prime Minister's writ runs. I spoke to someone who had a very senior position in Downing Street during the Blair years and says it is absolutely clear that there is trouble being made by certain civil servants who probably side with Simon Case, who feel that there is something wrong. They just don't like the whole smell of Sue Gray having left the civil service and gone to such a senior political position, and that somehow it's a transgression about the natural order of things, on which side of the bridge you stand, whether you're a civil servant or a politician. And there are people who have got it in for her and want to do her down. And, yes, siding with Simon Case in this, who obviously kind of looks better the worse it gets for Sue Gray.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I guess at the heart of it is the question of, did the Prime Minister know she was getting paid more? Almost certainly yes. Would he care? Almost certainly no. So then you're down to this question of, are we saying that the Prime Minister should be paid more than like anybody else that works with him or for him or alongside him? And on what basis do we make that sort of assumption? I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because on the face of it, it sounds pretty obvious. Like nobody should be paid more than the Prime Minister. But I guess there are very different jobs and very different kind of ways of being remunerated.
Of course there are. And I think that it's, the Prime Minister may not earn as much as the CEO of a FTSE 100 company, probably earns a tenth or a hundredth of that. But when you leave office,
the Prime Minister of the UK at that time.
And when you leave office, you can be sure that they will be able to write a book or whatever it happens to be.
And we know that writing books is very lucrative.
Are we going to talk about writing books?
Yeah, I think we should.
Well,
we haven't talked about it for about 4 days. I've missed it.
Strangeland is coming out next week, next Thursday.
Wait. The other thing we have to say.
Oh, is there what? There's something else more than my book.
Yes, your book is coming out on the 26th of September. But before that, on Friday, we are going to put the tickets on sale for our road trip.
Wow.
Yeah.
To the Royal Albert Hall on the 1st of December. We are not nervous. We're very relaxed about it. We could practically walk there.
We're going to do a pilgrimage from Leicester Square to the Albert Hall, telling tales as we go.
Tickets on sale from 10 o'clock on Global Player.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.